Well, let's get the answer to some of those questions now from the man himself, fresh from the conference platform. The Business Secretary, Vince Cable, is here. Your phone's switched off? Not expecting any text from Ed Miliband, as you talked about in your speech?
No, not at all. We had a little joke about it, and I think that's the spirit in which that whole issue should be dealt with frankly.
Well, let's talk about more serious matters. So the business bank. First of all, the point that Tony Dolphin just raised, is it a one-off £1 billion, as it were, or have you managed to get £1 billion per year?
Well, it's one-off for the moment, but depending on the success and depending on demand, we will deal with increases in future. But the important step, and it's a very, very important step, is actually getting this off the ground. And if this can leverage in £10 billion of funding into SMEs, we're talking about large sums of money. I mean, the total amount at the moment is only 50 billion, so 10 makes a big difference.
And how confident are you that you can really get this going in an 18-month timescale? Because there are a few obstacles to go through, aren't there? I mean, for a start, have you applied for a licence from the FSA, the watchdog?
Oh, well, until we've got an agreement, we couldn't do anything, and obviously those steps we'll need to go through. But I think the commentators have been a bit negative. I mean, actually, if you look at what's happened with the green investment, for example, we haven't yet got state aid approval, but we've got a team in my department that is actually now getting money out of the door to waste projects, energy efficient projects. It's a kind of precursor to the Green Investment Bank operating under more limited condition, but it is actually functioning, and we've got agreement on a license from the Financial Services Authority. So these things can happen more quickly than I think your commentators were allowing us.
Well, the Times says that the Treasury is warning that the idea would conflict with single market rules. Have you had any warnings from the Treasury about this?
Well, its design will have to be carefully constructed. We've devoted a lot of thought to this, and it doesn't just come out of the blue.
Has the Treasury warned you then?
Well, the Treasury is supporting this, let's be quite clear. It was the Chancellor who went out first and made it clear we were doing this, and I'm working very closely and actually harmoniously with him on it. So I don't know who's giving you this negative story. This is not the way the Chancellor and I are approaching it. We realise there's a real need. And John Cridland, I think, described part of that need, but there's also an issue of kind of new banks coming. We've got, it isn't just the big four. We've got lots of other banks now coming into business lending. They need to be able to access funds in order to expand. There is non-bank lending, which is growing because the banks are so sticky, and that needs support. So there are lots of different ways in which this bank could operate.
Just to be clear, that this bank is about lending for the long term. It's not going to get going for at least 18 months, possibly longer. So this isn't going to help businesses who are struggling to find finance right now.
Well, not tomorrow, no. But I don't want to be pessimistic about the timescales, because I think there are ways in which we can move quite quickly on it. I don't want to give a date. But I certainly accept that if what we get out of this is something that fills a big long-term requirement, as the way John Cridland of the CBI described it, I think that would be a really big achievement. As long as I can remember, and I was teaching economics 40 years ago, we talked about this gap in the system where, successful British companies can't compete with the Germans, for example, because they can't get access to this kind of long-term money. So if we can fill that gap and really address it, we will achieve something historic.
Could the real problem, though, be lack of demand in the economy? This is sometimes what the banks themselves say, is the reason that people aren't applying for loans is that people aren't buying the products that they're creating.
Well, there is a demand issue, and I spent quite a bit of time in my speech addressing that problem and how we deal with it. But it isn't just that. I mean, we do surveys of small business lending in our department, and there is quite a high rejection ratio, particularly from good manufacturing companies. Companies are trying to export to emerging markets, the kind of thing we're urging them to do, and they can't get support from the banking system at present.
Let's move on to how the government plans to raise money. Nick Clegg has said that the top 10% of the country should face new taxes. Now, that's not just millionaires, is it? It's people earning £47,000 a year. Is that what you intend, to hit people on those kind of incomes?
Well, we went into the last general election with a fairly comprehensive approach to taxation that was emphasis on fairness. And I think Nick is going back to those principles. But, the one specific thing I was talking about today was very extreme wealth, if you like, which we haven't dealt with. And I brought back the Lib Dem policy of the so-called mansion tax and very high-value property wealth. Why aren't we doing something about it?
That doesn't sound like the top 10%, though, which Nick Clegg was talking about. Are you saying that there shouldn't be a focus on the top 10%?
No, I'm not contradicting him at all. They're different ideas. He's basically making the point, absolutely rightly, that at the moment there is a sort of squeeze on average incomes and on people at the bottom, and the burden needs to be relatively high amongst people who've got the broadest backs, and that's
including
how
people on incomes of £47,000 a year.
No, he wasn't making proposals in respect of income tax at that level. I was focusing on the issue of wealth, and particularly extreme property wealth. This extraordinary anomaly that you have these properties in London at the moment. In one case, it's worth over 300 million, and they pay, just barely £1,000 in council tax. Absolutely outrageous.
But and
that's the kind of thing that needs to be dealt with.
So, and you've talked about that a lot, but that is different, isn't it, from the top 10%?
Well, in our manifesto at the last general election, we set out all kind of proposals as to how the income tax system should be made fairer. And it was designed to benefit the people at the bottom and in the middle. And we've actually made progress in that, in terms of lifting the threshold.
There are all sorts of different kinds of taxes.
Well, you're talking about income tax. You're talking about the top percent of income.
No, I'm talking about the top percent of people who earn that amount of money. I'm not saying that tax may come on their income necessarily. You talked about mansion tax, and in your speech you said the idea horrifies Tory backwoodsmen. But what about the Chancellor? Is he persuadable, do you think?
Well, I talked to a lot of Conservatives who actually find a lot of sense in this idea. They think it's fair. They think it's practical because, mansions can't run away. They think we ought to be shifting the burden of taxation from incomes onto wealth, property, land. It's a more sensible principle of taxation. And I think you'd be surprised by the number of Conservatives who have an open mind about it.
Including the Chancellor?
Well, I've certainly had perfectly good discussions with the Chancellor about it, and he's an intelligent man, and he sees the pros and cons, so I doubt if he's totally ruled it out, but I still have some persuasion to do.
The door's a tiny bit open. I want to talk to you about something that a lot of people are discussing in the corners around here, and that's the leadership of the party. Lord Oakeshott was asked today if Nick Clegg was going to be leader at the next election, and he replied, "Who knows?" Now, everybody believes that Lord Oakeshott is a close friend of yours and speaks for you.
He's a friend of mine, but he doesn't speak for me, I can assure you of that. He's a serious and substantial politician in his own right with his own views, and we sometimes agree and quite often disagree.
So he shouldn't have said that?
I'm not telling him what he should and shouldn't say, but I made my support for Nick Clegg absolutely clear in the conference today.
You also had a crack in your conference speech about an issue that's dominating the news, and that's the woes of Andrew Mitchell. You talked about social class in the coalition and said you were making a joke as a mere pleb. Do you think Andrew Mitchell has drawn a line under this?
Look, I don't know what his position is. That's a matter for him and the Prime Minister. I never heard the conversation which he had with the police officer. I didn't even listen to his statement this morning. Frankly, I was on a factory visit with Nick Clegg, so there's no way I can take that forward. He's made his apology. And as I say, it's for him and the Prime Minister to decide where to go next.
I can clarify it for you. He said exactly the same as he said last week in his written apology. And your Lib Dem colleague, Jeremy Brown, has said that his statement leaves loose ends to be tied up. Jeremy Brown said, "I think people want to know what was said. Explaining to the media what was not said is not the same as explaining what was said." Do you think he needs to clarify this a bit more?
No, I think it's, there's nothing whatever that I have to add to this that my colleagues haven't already said.
Vince Cable, many thanks indeed for joining us.